Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the subtext of your presentations panel, where we will be talking a little bit about the use of language, specifically how we use language in this beautiful craft of ours, which is improvised theater, and what it means to do it in other languages, what it means, what social responsibility do we have if we have it, and all sorts of cool stuff that will come up with our panelists, which I will introduce at first. So we have Daniela Landert, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, who is an improviser and linguist, and she is leading a research project on exactly this, on the language of improv. Oh, hello, Daniela. Then we have Felipe Ortiz, who is also an improviser, a clown, circus artist, and he's always exploring the expressive body. So his take on the use of language would be super interesting. And of course, we have Joe Bill, who's also an improviser, and who, amongst other things, he's studying the neuroscience around self-consciousness, which is something I'm totally going to ask him about later on in our chat. Before we begin our panel, I want to tell, you probably already know to the audience. So, on the right of your screen, there is a chat where you can write stuff and comments, but most importantly, there is a button that says Q&A. Now, if you click there, you can write your questions to the panelists. Should you have any at any point, feel super free to write your questions there. And not only you can write your questions, but you can also vote, let's say, on the questions of other people. So if someone asks a question that you think is very interesting, you can like that, like on Facebook, and I will be always going there and seeing what questions you're asking, and possibly we will asking these questions too to our panelists. So feel free to use that tab of the chat. Now, let's get started. I have a question. I would like to begin a question with a question to all of you, which is this. So, as opposed to scripted work, for example, scripted theater and cinema, where the creation of characters is also given by some physical cues, like the dresses and the makeup, and even maybe the preparation of our characters. In improv, we tend to delegate that a lot to our words, to how we speak. Do you think we are doing it too much? Do you think we're doing it right? What are your thoughts on this? Do you think we can do better? And so I would like to ask the same question to all of you. We begin with Daniela, then Joe, and then Felipe. Thank you. So Daniela.
Okay. There is a lot I could say about this. I try not to go into a lecture and try to order my thoughts. So
feel free. We're here until 4.
Yeah. No, just interrupt me if I'm too long. Well, I think there are two different ways in which we can use language to create our characters, right? So we can either do the explicit characterization, where we say, okay, my name is so-and-so, I'm 45 years old, I'm a painter, and so on and so forth. So naming explicitly the traits that we have, either of ourselves or of another character. Or we can use language to create characters by just using the language in the way of a character of that identity would use language, right? So these are two very different ways of using language. And both of them are used in all works of fiction. We always have this kind of explicit characterization and implicit characterization through the use of language, even if we have kind of physical attributes as well. I have the feeling that in improv, especially in the kind of more dramatic style improv, we use a lot of this implicit characterization of just trying to behave and act in the way in which a character would act, and we often avoid the labeling, the explicit labeling, so as a kind of a cheap way of creating characters. One thing that I find really interesting is to look at ways in which we can still use the labeling, but in perhaps a bit more creative ways, right? And not being quite so plump. And I'm currently working on a study in which I look at how explicit characterization is used in television series. Television series, I look only at pilot episodes, so they have the task of introducing characters in an interesting way in very little time. And these characters will be central for the entire duration of the series. And so I looked just at the first 5 minutes of pilot episodes to see what kind of means are actually used to introduce the protagonist of the series. How are they presented? What role do the physical attributes play? What role does language play? And the interesting thing is that actually these explicit characterizations, these labelings, they are extremely important. They happen so often, but they're kind of wrapped into things that we don't notice them so much. So for instance, in most pilot episodes, one of the first series, the protagonist meets a person whom they have never met before, and they just need to introduce themselves naturally. So it's not perceived as being strange to have that kind of explicit labeling, because it's kind of embedded into a situation where it feels natural. And I think
we'll come back. We'll come back to that, to this exact point. I will ask something close to that in a moment. So Joe, do we talk too much as to introduce our character, to present our characters, to portray our characters?
I think in different cultures and different countries, I think in North America and the States especially, I think we rely on the verbal more than we do the physical. I think Felipe can speak to the physical, so I'll try to save that volleyball bump to him in a second. I agree with Daniela. There's so much we could talk about, and we could be here for 3 days and talk about just this topic. So it is difficult to sort of focus. Based on what Daniela said, one way to look at characters, the way that I teach, is how you do what you do is who you are. So that's embodiment. But it's also how you do what you do is informed by what's inside of you. So when we improvise, there's 2 ways to create character. We can create from the inside out, or we can create from the outside in. And then depending on if we're performing on a screen or we're performing live, there's 2 different contexts for the audience. So if we're performing on a screen, we are forcing the audience to to look or give their attention where we want to give them attention. And we are limited by the angle of the camera as to how much of our body we're showing. So if it's a close-up, if we're going to deliver a line of dialogue or context, then it's probably going to be close-up. But if it's farther away, then there will be some embodiment that's part of that. I think when we improvise for story or narrative, the tendency is to lead things verbally, to give ourselves labels so the audience can say, this is their story, this is what they want, these are the people in their way. And another way, and then we discover the depth of the characters and the truth of their interactions emotionally over time. The other way that we can work is we can start with the emotional aspect of the character and how we listen to the other character. And so this question of neuroscience and self-consciousness, the reason I look at this is because we want to be able to listen to our partner more than we're listening to ourselves. So we create an inner self so we can receive what the partner is giving to us, so we can respond in the moment. And through the deep interactions, over time, we discover what the story or the structure is. So the first is working outside in, the second is working inside out. And how you do what you do is who you are is one way to go about language.
Okay. Thank you. And yeah, the same question goes to Felipe, and it's relevant to say that he has a format which is
Speechless.
travels.
Ironically, that happened.
The
at
word
perfect
itself
time.
is without words. So it's even fair to ask, like, when we portray our character in improv, like, do we speak too much? How else can we do this, Felipe?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we speak too much. I will say most of the times we don't speak what is needed. Like we speak a lot of trash around what can be relevant to create a character. So most of the times when you see an improv scene and they are presenting their characters, and if you think, how would I edit this? You will just cut a lot of the stuff that they are saying because it's useless. What Joe was saying for me is like an ideal state of mind, and I don't think that's the common thing of improvisers. Like we see a lot of what Daniela said, like kind of cheap building of characters and not grounded, empty characters. And I also find a lot of times a disconnection between what they are saying and what their bodies are saying. So that brings in the mind something for the audience that for me is like it's not believable, you know? Like you might say with your words that you are sick or weak, but you see a full body action. So it's not that they go in those pieces of information. So I also think that when you create a character from your body, and I think Joe can say more about this, as you work with the body, it makes you start feeling stuff. And if you are a good listener as an improviser, the first person that you have to listen to is yourself. So if you embrace a body for your character and you are able to hear what that body is telling you, you start thinking as a character and talking as a character, and maybe you will disconnect for that cheap talk, if we can call it somehow. Yeah.
Thank you. So going back to this concept of playing, as Felipe was saying, like the truthful characters, that they speak like they act, that they speak as if they've been listening to themselves, and connecting also to what Daniela was saying earlier. So another topic that Daniela actually brought up in her paper, which is called, I read, the spontaneous co-creation of comedy, humor in improvised theatrical fiction. She mentioned a thing that is mind-blowing to me, which is like scripted actors. When you write a dialogue, scripted actors are trying to talk like real people, while us as improvisers, we are trying to talk as scripted actors. So to what extent, as improviser, is our use of language spontaneous? To what extent should we be spontaneous? Do we even have to look for that? Is that a topic, Daniela?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Anyway, Joe, both.
I could give a tiny piece.
Sure.
So that is going back to what Felipe said, and I think I guess I will be talking about the brain. Mm-hmm. So if we listen to ourselves first, the reason we listen to ourselves is to learn how to listen to the other person. So now if we're listening to ourselves, we can listen to ourselves strategically. So when I teach acting, I use the metaphor in our brains. We have an engineer and a jazz musician. So the engineer is where our language is contained. Our engineer wants to get things right. It's where our ego is. It's where we like to measure things. We judge things. It's also where our verbal awareness of story exists. And our inner critic exists in there. So if we're playing a story from the outside in, we know what story we're telling. We know who we have to be in the story. We're in this engineering point of view. The way our behavior shows up tends to reflect a degree of self-consciousness about our doing right or doing wrong inside of the story. So that affects our behavior. If we're in the jazz, and the idea is to have these working in harmony. If we're in the jazz part, I feel the music in me, the music in you, the music between us, and we let the engineer track the context. I'm sorry, that was longer than I meant it to be.
It's fine, don't worry.
I'm a nerd.
I'm
a nerd.
We're here for this. We're here for this. It's great.
Yeah, I'll just concerning your question before. I think if we look at scripted fiction, right? So scripted fiction. You have a writer or a team of writers who create dialogue which is very dense, right? So each line, each word matters, especially if we look at TV and film, or also theater, in fact. So it's just every word is valuable, every word has to matter. And at the same time, this density is balanced with naturalness. So you have things like filler words, you have discourse markers like well, you know, and so on, which give a more natural feel to the entire dialogue. And the amount of this kind of filler language in relationship to the language that matters, let's just simplify that for a bit, is very much also a question of style. So in different styles of fiction, you find a more naturalistic style of language use or a less naturalistic style of language use. And still overall, you tend to have much more information density than in natural conversation. Natural conversation, you have lots of repetition, you have overlaps, you need to clarify things. So you say it again, you have sentences that you don't finish and you start over and it's not syntactically correct and so on and so forth. Spontaneous conversation is completely messy, okay? And in one of the reasons for that is also that we have cognitive constraints. I mean, we need to do all that without much planning. If we're just in a spontaneous conversation, we process language, we think about what to say, we realize, oh no, that's not actually what I wanted to say. And what was that word again? So we need to buy ourselves time, and we do that by using things like repetition and so on. When we are improvisers, we're somewhere in between there. So we have the same challenges that we have in natural, spontaneous conversation, but at the same time, we try to make our dialogues really meaningful and dense, and so that every word matters, so that it's a bit like scripted fiction, so that you cannot see the struggles that we have by dealing with all this kind of online processing. And one of the things that I'm interested in is just to find out, you know, what kind of tools can we use to make this a bit easier for us? How can we buy ourselves time in a way that's still beautiful and meaningful, and where we can find meaning while preparing what to say? So, for instance, I'm a great fan of repetition because that can do all of that. Repetition is highly poetic. You find it in poetry. It's so meaningful. You can turn that into leitmotifs and so on and so forth. You can use it for characterization. At the same time, it's a great way to buy yourself time and to think about what to say. It's also a great tool for listening. And that's just, you know, as one example of how we can kind of bridge that gap between creating beautiful, meaningful dialogue and at the same time dealing with these real-time issues.
So your take is that basically we should try to create beautiful, meaningful dialogue where no word is wasted, ideally, while we're improvising.
Well, it's a stylistic issue. I mean, we can do Woody Allen style improv where we just talk a lot and create meaning out of lots of text. But I think generally, yes, I would say we should try to treat our language as if everything was meaningful and to deal with language in that way.
Okay, thank you. And so now, I'm hearing a little bit of echo. I don't hear anymore. Okay, good. So let's bring in the elephant in the room, because of course, guys, I at this point it's necessary. So, and I would like to address this question to Felipe first, but then of course we're all going to talk about it, I'm sure. So, improvising in other languages. Now, it is a thing. We all of us here, we improvise in at least two languages, very least two languages, and it changes a few things. It changes from the way that we approach characters, and also I'm going to bring that back also in another context, which is how we approach character stereotypes in the just only in the words that we use. So, so Felipe, how does improvising in another language change the way you improvise and you approach characters from a point of view of how you define your characters and how you define other people's characters?
I was, yeah. So at the beginning, it was crazy because I wasn't really aware. I started traveling and performing in English at the beginning, and I found that it was very difficult to follow English speakers or even non-English speakers as we were improvising. So I started getting feedback from other improvisers about how physical you are and how wonderful is the way you treat language. And at the beginning, I didn't notice it, like I was just there trying to survive. And then I started kind of researching what was happening to me as I improvise in English or French or any other language that I'm able to. And I realized that something was triggering in my body as I had this difficult with language sometimes. So that brought me to try to figure it out and put it in words. So I started investigating or like doing a research with my own way of improvising and how different it was to improvise in Spanish or in English or in another language. And then I came with this big question, like, how much do we need words? And that brought me through the process to create Speechless with some friends. And Speechless is a long form without words. And it was a really interesting experience because it all comes from the body and what you can say with your body. And the thing with this is that it becomes completely universal, like everybody understands the body, but not everyone understands language or specific things, like slang, like very specific things from language, from every part. Sometimes you don't really get what they are saying, right? So I think I'm a different improviser in Spanish than in English than in French. Also because I think language, and Daniela for sure knows more about this, language builds your way of thinking. And Spanish has a structure that makes you think in a specific way, and English has another structure that makes you think in a specific way, or French. And for example, there are things that you can say in one language that you can't say in another language because there is no exact translation. But with the body, everyone understands slapstick. Everyone in the world, like if we go to comedy, everyone can read a sad body,
Hmm.
So yeah, That
So
for that, and let me just wrap up a thing from the other question that you didn't ask me, just connected to what Daniela was saying. Impro, you can train your language in a genre, and you can train it like you go to a gym and train your muscles to be able to, or as in sports, you train basketball and you throw, and then when you're playing, you don't think about the training, you just react, right? So I think a specific genre, you can also train your language to be able to be fluid in your language in that specific genre. But also, I sometimes when I see very sharp impro that looks like a set piece, I miss the impro part, the struggling, the spontaneity of it. That's it.
Okay, thank you. So which brings us, I mean, I also improvise in English, and it's obviously not my first language. And sometimes what Felipe was saying is, I think it's very true, that sometimes like the thing you want to say is just not there, because it's just all languages, like different languages lead you to think differently. And this is super fascinating. And before we move on to the next point, I still want to ask Joe.
I can add one.
Yeah, please.
I can add one thing to that. Is when I started improvising in French, I realized if the translator on my brain is turned on, I'm dead. And so what we're talking about is you can improvise where words are the goal. You can also improvise where words are the consequence of something else. And so Felipe, he leads body, emotion, words. And for me, I lead emotion, body, words. But Felipe and I do a show in French. And part of when we do theater, what we're doing is creating tension for the audience. So we're not going to play the same type of character that I would play in English or Felipe would be in Spanish, because we know part of the tension for the audience is, will these guys speak French? And because of this tension, we also know that our characters' behavior are inside the story, but we're also playing with the audience of like, I don't know, maybe we're not.
Yeah, thank you. I was just about to ask you something very similar to this, so you anticipated me. Cool. So, yeah.
But so, I wanted to bridge to Daniela because I'm starting to do a mind melt with Daniela. So I saw her eyes go like, oh, okay, I've got something here.
Do you wanna add something, Daniela?
Perhaps just briefly. Yeah, before Felipe mentioned that, language does something because languages are structured differently, so it affects our improv. I think that's true. I think in addition to that, it's also that we just use different languages in different contexts, and we bring that with us as well. So for me, English is a professional language. I teach in English at university. I work in English. It's my work language. Whereas German is a much more private language. And Italian is still private, fun, because I speak that with my partner only. And so it's my relationship language. And so when I go on stage and I use a different language, I realize how I bring this background with me. So certain types of characters I find much easier to play in English or in standard German, for instance, instead of in Swiss German, high status characters, because I myself, I'm more often in high status roles when I use these languages. And for kind of very emotional scenes, I find it much easier to play this in Swiss German, because that's the language that I usually use when I talk about my emotions and personal experiences. And so when I first started performing in different languages, I realized how, on one hand, I had very different associations, even just simply word associations. I think of different terms if I hear the same term in English or the equivalent term in German or in Italian, which I find interesting, but also this kind of what I bring with me on stage and the types of characters that I can perform, the types of energies that I can tap into changes completely.
Thank you. And this brings us exactly to our second and probably last segment of our panel here, which is exactly related to this. So, because different languages for many reasons. So Felipe said one, which is languages are structured differently. Daniela said another, because different languages bring us to a different part of our brain, let's say. So different language, we approach improv from different aspects. We go in different spaces of our mind. I wanted to approach a little bit the topic of let's say stereotypes in a way, because I have the feeling that there are some languages which are more stereotype oriented, and some languages which are a little bit less. I want to, like, for example, Italian. I'm obviously Italian, so we have some words, for example, the words for captain and the word for director, which are declined at masculine. They do exist in feminine, but they're not really used. So that brings, like, using that, the languages in a sense, brings us, like, kind of, it's the language itself that kind of drives us to using stereotypes in this way. Whereas, for example, English doesn't. You can say director, and it's if you're not a native, can be both a man or a woman, whereas in Italian, if you say direttore, it's a man, direttore. So I wanted to ask you also this, like, in your personal experience as improvisers, so as players, and even maybe most importantly as directors, because you're all directors, you all seen millions of hours of improv. Did you see this difference in approach to character work, depending on the language? Some language were more socially advanced, I want to say. It's a broad definition, I know it's not very precise, but you see what I mean. And this is a question for everyone, anyone who has to contribute, really.
I'm happy to say something to that. I would strongly disagree with, and we said before we were willing to disagree on this panel. So I take this opportunity to strongly disagree with calling some languages more socially advanced than others, because I think there are just different strategies that these languages offer. And in the end, it all boils down to awareness that's needed by whoever uses language and whoever performs in improv. If you have a language where the terms are gendered, you have the opportunity of making of marking the choice. So if you use direttrice, it's very clear that you speak of a woman, and you can break these expectations, or you can mark things very clearly. At the same time, also in English, where you don't have this gendering on the level of the linguistic term, we still have the same stereotypical associations with the words. And very often there are linguistic studies on this, fascinating studies. And there's this riddle about, going to the hospital and the doctor says, I cannot operate on my son. And how is that possible because the father is already there, and the doctor is actually a woman, and so on. I do that with my students often, and even with kind of 20-year-olds. If they hear the term surgeon, it takes them 10 minutes to figure out that this could be a woman. And so there are just different opportunities there in the language and different ways of using that. And we need to find different strategies of addressing that, of dealing with language. But I don't think inherently one option is better or worse than the other. It's just we need to use these differently.
Thank you. I just want to specify that I wasn't saying that there are languages that are more socially advanced than other, especially. I'm Italian, so of course I think my own language is the most beautiful in the world. Of course, my question was more like, do you see a difference in how character work and stereotype is approached by default in one language as opposed to another? That's as a broad question. I was seeing Felipe was cheering when you said, Daniela said something and Felipe was cheering. What was it? What was that, Felipe?
No, I was just playing a little bit. I agree with what Daniela said about choices. I think the language is there as clay, and we decide what shape to give.
Fair. Joe?
And I also think as an English speaker, when I speak in languages that are gendered, part of the tension for the audience is, oh, first of all, oh, this American speaks a second language. That's amazing. Secondly is they know that I don't know the genders of stuff. And so I can only be believable, you know, so far down. Like I also have to embrace when I perform that English is, or that French is my second language, or that Spanish is my third language. Like that's part of my character's truth if we're playing for truth. But I think there's also, when you're talking about, I think we're also talking about bias, like social bias and different culture and cultural bias.
Of course, yes.
I think the role that cultural bias plays in game is different than roles that cultural bias plays in scene. And so neurologically, our brains our brains have the opportunity to work differently. They don't always. When we're playing a game versus when we're doing a scene where we're following the relationship, where in the middle of those two ways of thinking are long forms, narratives, things where some of this is a game and some of this we're following the relationship. But when you're speaking in a language that's not your mother tongue, there's always going to be a part of that where the game of will they be able to come up with these words is going to exist. And what Felipe and I do is we make the internal choice when we speak French that whatever we say is perfect French. And then, of course, that leads us into kind of a verbal clowning because the disposition of these guys is very self-assured unless we share a moment together like, oh, shit, we don't know where we are.
Okay, cool. Because my point is, like, I think that as performers and we speak to an audience, even if in the theater there are two people, it's still our job is to speak to an audience. And then like my personal take is that we have to be in a way mindful that the way that we speak will form and will kind of help to shape reality in a way, and our thoughts and other people's thoughts too. And so I was looking into this, like if the difference in languages could, how, let's say this, how the difference in languages intervenes in this process of our communication, which is not just a communication of the content of our scenes, but at a deeper layer, because language is like works at a deeper layer. So that's what I was interested in knowing. So for our last thing, so I have to ask Daniela thing, because this is so on your site, I saw that you have done all of a study on hesitation markers. Like, please tell me something about that, because you mentioned they're not just hesitation, they mean so much more. So I have to ask, what's that?
Yeah, I love them. We're currently working on a study on them and really spending a lot of time of just, you know, looking at instances of these and trying to decide what kind of function do they have there. And the interesting thing about them is, I mean, many people hate them. Okay, many people try to just avoid them and think, it's awful, we shouldn't use them. But if you look, for instance, at scripted fiction, they're there quite frequently, actually, and they fulfill a number of functions. For instance, my favorite function of them is to mark lies, okay? Because if you have a piece of fiction, let's say, especially in films or televisions where we don't have a lot of narrator voice, a character says something and the audience needs to understand that this is a lie, whereas the other characters in the fictional plot need to believe the lie as truth. Okay, so how do you do that as a scriptwriter to mark that? And hesitation markers are so crucial. So very often when you look at lies in fiction, you will see that the character, before lying, uses a hesitation marker, and we interpret this as, oh, this is not truthful. the funny thing is actually that I have to follow up on that. I haven't really investigated it fully, but there are psychological studies who found they did these experimental trials with people in real life. And some people had to say the truth and others had to lie. And those saying the truth used more hesitation markers than those lying. Okay, weird. Explanation of that, because we think that hesitation markers signal lies and untruthfulness and evasiveness. If we tell a lie, we try to avoid them because we want our lie to be believed. So we don't use them. We use them more often when we're actually being truthful. But in fiction, because we associate them with lying, we use them to mark for the audience that this is a lie.
I can just add a quick thing. Another use of hesitation markers is to show vulnerability. So it could be a choice in the moment for a character to use a marker, a or a or it could also be, if you're in the moment and in response to your partner, it could be a result of your reaction, and you hear the sound come out of your throat and you let that be because that's the truth of indecision, of conflict. Will I be changed? So I think that would be another side of the same coin. Absolutely.
Politeness is another common instance. Or actually, I passed last night talking of the life as a linguist, and I watched James Bond, Dr. No, and I counted all the hesitation marker and marked them in a transcript to analyze how often they're used and if they're more or less frequent than Inspector, which I watched 2 nights ago and did exactly the same thing. They're more frequent in Dr. No than Inspector. I can tell you that, which is interesting. Because we usually think that language is becoming more informal, and so the older one actually has more hesitation marker. One thing that was interesting in Dr. No, always when characters were talking on the phone, they started with a hesitation marker. Not always, but almost always, okay, a lot. So it's also a mark of, okay, I'm about to say something in mediated communication that's actually not face-to-face. And I'd be interested in knowing whether that's just something that we do differently today because we're more used to these mediated forms of communication, or whether this is something specific to fiction to mark that. I don't know. I'm certainly going to look into that. I'll tell you when I find out.
Okay, thank you. That was beautiful. Like the thought of you watching during the night and marking the hesitation mark. I'm in love. Okay, wonderful.
Let me just say something to Daniela.
Sure.
You should see how Bogota people speak, or Colombian Spanish is, because we use a lot of So there are jokes that we can communicate without words, just with sounds. So
okay. Right. So thank you. Okay. Thank you all so much. That was our time. It's 4. So just before we leave, let's give you just one last round each to plug in your links, your projects, things that people should absolutely go out there right now and check out. They're also in the chat if you scroll up in the chat, but suppose that someone's not looking at the chat. What do people have to check out to see what's relevant? Let's begin with Daniela.
Yeah, you can find information about my research project on the project website, which is improv.study. And you can also find the link in my profile. And if you want to know more, just write to me, let me know. I'm happy to hear from you.
Thank you. Joe?
Integratedimprovisation.com or Joe Bill Teaches, ! On Facebook.
Okay, thank you. Remember the exclamation point. And Felipe?
On Instagram at Felipe Theater, and on Facebook under my name. There you will find all workshops and tours and stuff.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining us in this panel. That's our time. I'll pass the ball back to Paul. I'm sorry.